Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us once again on this Sunday. It's the last day of the month of April 2023. It's a day before the what you call the May Day in our country, the country of ours known as South Africa. Umtungo Malingi, Undima Kankumbuzo welcomes you once again into this wonderful conversation. And if you are joining us for the first time in your life, we are so grateful. If you are watching on Twitter there, where we are at Ponte Politik, thank you very much. And if you are with us on Facebook, also, Umalingi Kayengwayo is saying thank you very much for that. But mainly on YouTube, if you are also on YouTube, make sure that you click on the subscribe button, because you are equally available on the YouTube platform, including Instagram and TikTok. Yes, as I had said to you, that we are very grateful to have you, as many people as possible, in this platform and in these conversations. On the Politik, for those who have not been part of this platform, and I see you. I see those that are on YouTube. I see those that are on Facebook. I see also those that are on Twitter. Thank you very much. Just ensure that you just like our program as well for the day. South Africa has always been understood. Let me talk about post 1994. South Africa has always been understood that the month of April is the month of freedom. And therefore, Ponte Politik had taken a theme along this understanding that the month of April is a month of freedom. And it is always predicated on the fact that it is a freedom against apartheid. Now, majority of people who have engaged in the struggle against apartheid, as limited as that is, they have always considered the international community as an integral part of the struggle against apartheid. That is, as of the people who produced, if one were to say, or who assisted in the development or in the winning over of the political freedom in South Africa from 1994. And there were other players in the game, systems, laws, organizations, and all of that were taking the struggle against apartheid, utilizing various methodologies and methods to ensure the struggle against apartheid is succeeding. So today we want to look at that particular aspect, this political dimension, but that includes the international system. We've had people who have looked at the international system as one of the best breeding grounds for the freedom. But also you have had others who have then said, made a critique against that particular notion, stating that no. Actually, the international community must not be seen to be entirely forgiven, if one were to say, on the atrocities of apartheid, because of how it had structured its rules, it has structured its politics, it has structured its laws, and so on and so forth. And today our guest is going to be interrogating some of these political dimensions, but mixing them up with international law, international politics, and apartheid. And I would like you to ensure that you participate in this conversation. You send us your comments, you send us your views, whatever the view that you have, you put it across so that we can be able to further the conversation. Anything goes. We are in that particular conversation. And as many of you might have been aware that our guest today is Tana Mohamed Mahoka, and she is going to be interrogating with us this particular conversation and these particular issues. And she will be using her understanding and her outlook in how she views this particular debate. And as I have said to you already, that if one begins to look at these things, we're talking about apartheid and the international systems. Tana, good evening. How are you doing?
Hi, Tando. I'm good. It's good to be here.
Um, Thank you very much for joining us once again. And it's been about 15, 20 days that you are back into this platform. On the 21st of March, we were interrogating the issue of Sharpeville and Langa massacre. And today we're talking about apartheid and, the international law, international politics, and international system. And there is a thinking that you say apartheid and racism is not dead in South Africa. And that is the thinking that you want to bring into this conversation, that apartheid and racism is not dead in South Africa. But why would you make this particular argument when many of us are of the view that no, we passed that life and we've done all we could about apartheid? So why are you making that particular argument? Take us through so that we can understand your thinking as well and teach us at the same time.
Thanks, Tando. Such a great introduction. I'm going to respond in three ways. I'm going to start off with a couple of definitions, and then I'm going to explain the fundamental thesis, and then I'm going to speak about the far-reaching implications of this thesis. So you've rightly said the international system is about the global community of states and international organizations, the relationships they have with one another, the rules that govern those relationships, right? Explicit rules through international law, treaties and customary international law, norms, state practice, and also what states consider to be a legal obligation on themselves. But then there are also the unspoken rules, the unspoken conventions, attitudes, histories, and uninterrogated contexts that underpin how things are done. Racism, I define as discrimination according to race, ethnicity, or color, with the power to enforce that discrimination on lower caste people, so people who are considered lower on your hierarchical structure. Prof. Joel Mudiri, who's at Pretoria University, puts it this way: racism is not the shark, it's the water. In other words, it's not just about isolated instances of interpersonal racism, it's about everything about a way of life that suffocates the life out of Black people. Now, Biko defined Blackness or Black people as not only people who identify as non-white, but people who stand in solidarity with oppressed peoples. So it is essentially, Blackness is not just a biological term, it is actually a social and a political term. And then apartheid is then the systemization and the institutionalization of racial domination and oppression. So it's not just the fact that there are these racial attitudes and that there's racial discrimination, but that these things are then made explicit through physical infrastructure. I mean, we had those nie blanke, non-white signs up in South Africa everywhere during apartheid. We had laws that determined where we could live, what work we could do, who you could marry, etc. So those are the three definitions I wanted to start with. What is the international system? What is racism? What is apartheid? Right? So yes, the regime that we had in South Africa previously was called apartheid. And then we had a change in government in 1994, and people did believe that apartheid had died. But apartheid is more than just a governmental regime, it is a system. Apartheid continues to exist here and in other parts of the world to this day. And I think the only reason why we have this persistent idea that no man, apartheid is dead, is because we never had a shared and accurate definition of what apartheid actually is, which allowed one, apartheid denialism, to be far more easier to actually believe. And then two, the efforts we embarked on to deal with the legacy of apartheid, for example, the TRC, should have been designed completely differently if we had had a different understanding of what apartheid actually is, which is something that you spoke to in a previous podcast where we kind of unpacked the problems with the TRC. Then the fundamental thesis, as you said, that I am presenting today is that one, apartheid is not dead, and two, racism and apartheid is the fundamental logic that drives how the international system works. So Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh wrote a book on neo-apartheid where he explains this very well within the South African context. But beyond that, we have a plethora of Black intellectual thinkers and a history of Black resistance globally, which deals with how the world is essentially structured to be anti-Black. I'm not going to delve into the details of that today for the sake of time, but then the evidence of this fact that apartheid is not dead is not only based on this history of intellectual thought and Black resistance, it's also evidenced by the fact that apartheid is obscured, yet entrenched through use of physical force, but also cultural, legal, political, and economic violence, and all the articulations of power, which makes us believe that this is just how the world works. So because we believe this is just how the world works, we don't actually see that it is a problem. So it actually hides itself in plain sight. Then I just wanted to briefly talk about how apartheid and racism is a fundamental logic driving the international system. International law perpetuates racial inequality by providing the architecture for systems of racial domination to succeed. We see that in slavery, we see that through colonialism, and in the modern era, we see how international law is used to legitimize and facilitate cultural, social, and economic marginalization of Black people. So we have a whole school of thought that has been emerging over the last 20, 25 years called TWAIL, Third World Approaches to International Law, which goes into much detail. And there's a lot of scholarship around what this actually looks like. So it uses a critical race lens to analyze international law, looking at documents that have been produced historically and meetings that were had and committees that were formed and how those committees were formed and the composition of those committees. It also looks at the ways in which the agenda and the politics of the members of these decision-making bodies came to make the decisions that they did. It unpacks not, what race is and racial or racist attitude, how that is ingrained into the actual system of international law and how arguments were developed to account for these racist ideas of the status of native peoples and to justify dispossession and extraction from the lands of these colonized nations. But you'll find that a lot of TWAIL scholars are actually demonstrating how these are actually legal fictions, and it doesn't actually exist, and it is a political orientation, a political agenda, and the social construction of race that actually makes these legal fictions possible, and that they actually need to be removed from jurisprudence or the legal philosophies that underpin our law. And then very briefly, what is the implications of this thesis? Because racism and apartheid is not dead, and because it is the fundamental driving force of the international system, it's very difficult to address apartheid or racism anywhere in the world, because to do so would implicate the entire global community, who are all part of the system, the skewed system that has been created and entrenched over the last couple of centuries. And if we had to apply a wider decoloniality or decolonization frame, we would say that addressing racism and apartheid would mean undoing the machinery of how the world works, which is why decoloniality is seen as an overly radical and highly disruptive process. And so one would ask oneself, why would anyone want to engage in unpacking the racist and the historical context of the law, which is going to be so disruptive? And my answer is, because the world is fundamentally unjust. Every day we live in a world where the majority of people, because non-white people, Black people make up the majority of the world, are considered to be non-humans and are treated as such. Any other worldview would be illogical at best, but really is immoral. I was going to speak a little bit more about what decoloniality is because of the misconceptions, but I don't think we have sufficient time.
I want before you just move a bit, before if I'm not disturbing your presentation, the there was a, because these are your opening remarks that's why I'm not disturbing on them. But I wanted to understand there's something that you speak about the correct framing of apartheid or apartheid, the correct framing of apartheid, and also the limitations that you say you say when we look at these international systems, not to limit them only to jurisprudence or limit them to the law. Just give us a clear understanding on those 2 points before we can move going forward. Because I understand apartheid from a certain perspective, and now you are saying let's reconceptualize it, or let's properly conceptualize it. But also at the same time, you're talking about, when you talk about international systems, when you talk about international politics, international law, and other things, we should not consider them to be only jurisprudential. But you seem to be having an argument there. Just clarify for me there, so that at least the person who's watching is able to move with you, so that we don't ask you questions about the case law of specific things, because we will ask about the case law if there is a need.
So apartheid is not something that exists in a vacuum. Okay, it's not just a case of, oh, we had a couple of people who had some evil ideas. They then institute the system with certain laws which are problematic. And as soon as we have a democratic election, and this regime is then voted out of power, and we dismantle these laws, and we're done with apartheid, right? Apartheid was more than just those laws. It was a system of racial discrimination, racial domination, and it is a continuation of the political agenda of the social construct that is racism. So that is why when we deal with apartheid or analyzing apartheid, we have to look at it from a decolonial lens, right? Because if we look at the point of decoloniality is about critically analyzing the way things work. Sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. It's also about building a different kind of world by creating a space for A, rehumanizing oppressed peoples and Black peoples, B, recovering, valuing, and centering Black languages, ontologies, histories, and ways of knowing, and C, correcting the power imbalances and systems that perpetuate oppression of Black peoples. So if we understand what racism is and what colonialism is, and how apartheid systemizes and institutionalizes that, then we understand that when we're trying to dismantle apartheid, we have to go beyond the law, because we have to look at everything that system then sought to achieve in dominating a particular race group. They needed more than just law. They needed cultural violence. They needed economic violence.
So basically, if apartheid is iPhone 14, colonialism and racism is iPhone 9, or is iPhone 8.
Yeah.
So it's a logical flow.
Evolution of racism and coloniality.
It's not a new system. It's just
not a new system. It's just more explicit
something,
and more overt.
Okay, we got that right. Now then, move us to how do you link this argument with the point you are saying that remove then apartheid from the laws alone, that is, remove it from the jurisprudential thought process, but place it into a more of a overarching theme of society. How do you put that together? You were making an example of something. Please give me that again.
So I'm saying that analyzing apartheid and dismantling it forms part of the broader decoloniality movement theoretical framework. Because decoloniality says that we need to understand what is the purpose and the workings of coloniality, right? Because that is the seed from which apartheid comes. So you cannot deal. So it's like saying, if we use your analogy about the iPhone, right? It's like saying I want to now deal with iPhone 14, but I don't want to understand the Apple operating system,
Software,
but
the software
or the
itself.
software, the software itself, because that
Okay.
is the logic. The racism and the coloniality is the logic that drives what apartheid then becomes.
Okay, I hear you very well. And viewers at home, we've got Tana. She is engaging us on these particular issues, and I'm asking you to make your comments or questions as we are engaging, because these are part of the conversations. It's always better when the conversation flows from everybody else. So please put across your likes if you like it, put across your comments if you would, and your hearts and your reactions, whatever the case might be. But make sure that you engage in this conversation. So you were taking us then through. You're saying you don't want to talk about decoloniality, but there was another point that you wanted to put across. Now continue that thought so that we can begin to interrogate further these thinkings that you are having or these ideas that you're having.
I'm trying to think what was the point that you felt that I missed. Look, I mean, the ultimate objective of decoloniality is not only to dismantle the problem of coloniality, but it's also to pursue sovereign equality and the right to self-determination for Black people.
Okay.
So it's not only to address the fault, but it is also then to pursue what we should have had the fault not occurred.
Okay.
To put us in the original position of what we would have been if coloniality had not taken place. Of course, we will never have a world where it's never taken place. But yes, that is the.
So it's more humanistic. It's more humanistic in its nature. It wants to liberate humanity from
yes.
from this thinking that some people, because they look brown, they look black, they look darker than the others, therefore they are non-human.
And that is why we see such a problem with, for example, I mean, this is just one of the measures, but the most prominent measure that we took to deal with apartheid was the TRC. The TRC did not make adequate space for healing. The TRC did not deal adequately with the psychological, the cognitive, the cultural violence. It did not deal adequately with the economic violence. It only dealt with the fact that there were laws enacted in order to bring apartheid about, which then led to certain harms. But the impact of those harms themselves was not actually addressed. The assumption was that if we go through this process and we uncover these truths that we're searching for, and we bring some sort of closure to the events that had happened, then healing would emanate automatically from that. And that is a fallacy. Because healing is not something that happens automatically or without any intentionality. We had to put intentional measures in place in order to address it. So if I can just fast forward to illustrate this better, right? So I was going to talk about this later, but I think I'll just talk about it now. We can always crisscross between things. I want to quickly just quickly deal with the definition of apartheid in the 1973 convention, right?
Is this now you're thinking of how the international world understood this?
This is the culmination of at that point, in the 70s, the culmination of the evolution of this concept of apartheid. We can come back to it as a legal instrument, but I just want to speak to the multidimensional nature of apartheid that I think was quite well articulated in the convention to illustrate my point a little bit better.
And the convention represents the international body. It is part of the international body. It's not a domestic. Yes.
No, it's a UN convention. So I mean, it emanates out of the international system.
I want to make sure that those who are watching are able to understand that we move between the domestic and the international and the domestic. We move in between those particular spaces. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, let me maybe just say this now. I mean, the problem obviously with international law is that we have no global enforcing body for international law. So you cannot directly enforce it. All you can do is rely on indirect enforcement through relying on individual states to domesticate those laws and to carry out, in this case, I mean, apartheid was called a crime, so to actually carry out the prosecution and the judicial processes around that. So that is why, the national and the domestic and the international realm is intricately linked, because the international system cannot implement its recommendations itself. So if you look at Article 2 of the convention, it's got basically seven areas of different sorts of acts, policies, and practices which are criminalized under this convention or considered to be problematic, right? Number one, apartheid results in the infringements of rights and freedoms. It tends to elevate personality rights and talks about dignity, but really there are a number of rights that are violated through the crime of apartheid, right? But then it also talks under that about murder, torture, physical and psychological violence, arbitrary and illegal arrest and imprisonment, restricting freedom of movement, enforced exile and revoking citizenship. Then the second way, or the second act that is criminalized, is the denial of the full development of targeted peoples. And it links that to the right to education, because Black peoples under a system of apartheid are never allowed to reach their full potential, because they are seen as a subjugated people, a people that are there simply as a unit of labor to further the interests of the ruling class. It also results in, thirdly, the targeting of people for substandard living conditions. And I think the convention says something along the lines of encouraging living conditions that are meant to bring about the demise of the targeted people group. Fourthly, apartheid results in isolating targeted groups from political, economic, social, and cultural life of the country and preventing integration between groups. Fifthly, it results in spatial injustice and the creation of racialized ghettos and reserves. Six, it results in labor exploitation, and it particularly refers to the right to work and the right to form trade unions. And then seventh, it results in the persecution and repression of resistance actors or movements, and the right to freedom of assembly and association. So you see, there is just, apartheid is this total system that affects every aspect of life. And there is just no way that you could deal with apartheid simply through judicial processes or legislative measures or even political changes, right? I mean, I've identified what I think are 8 ways in which apartheid could be more adequately addressed if we understood it as a systematic concept. So yes, one would be, the judicial and legislative measures. 2 would be political changes, but also along with political changes, which we know we've done in South Africa, but what we haven't sufficiently done is, which is linked to the political, is to build people power, right? Because if we understand that apartheid means that racial discrimination is articulated through institutions, that we have to build people power in order to counteract the overreach and the repurposing of those institutions for private benefit, which is something that we see not only in the past in South Africa, but even right now. I mean, this whole state capture commission was about the repurposing of state institutions, and that is also an element of apartheid. It's a legacy of apartheid that we continue to see in our country, even though.
So it is on the basis of these elements as defined by the convention, which have been not addressed in the so-called transition in South Africa, that makes you stand boldly to say that apartheid and racism in South Africa is not dead.
Yeah.
Because,
and I mean, and I could even show it to you with the remaining measures that we have not done. I spoke to the first 2, which we've done to some extent, but I still need to actually show you what are the other things we should have done that we haven't done at all. And I'm sure as any South African who's listening to this, who's lived in this country long enough, who knows what has happened here and knows what has happened to their family members, will know
Mm-hmm.
the impact of what I'm saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay,
like
take us there.
judicial processes, political processes, right? Then we also needed to, thirdly, focus on healthcare, psychological, and social cultural interventions. Now, I have not explicitly seen, in our country where we actually enact policies to say these are the well-being and healthcare orientated measures that we're taking purely targeted towards the legacy of apartheid in our country. I mean, obviously, I come from a healthcare background. I studied medicine first, then social sciences and law. And so, I mean, I used to see this all the time, where you have, for example, um, people walking around with holes in their hearts, right? Congenital holes in their hearts. Because surgery for congenital defects was not prioritized for people of color in apartheid. So you just continue to live on with that thing until you succumb to the effects of that, right? We have the dope system, right? I mean, coming from the Western Cape, this was something that was very significant, where people right up until the 90s were being paid with alcohol instead of with wages, right? Which had massive healthcare implications, because now you have babies being born with fetal alcohol syndrome, and they have intellectual deficits that can never be overcome because the brains have been affected by the alcohol that their mother was drinking while they were pregnant with them, because actually the alcoholism has been induced by these unfair labor practices. That's just two examples. We know about the trauma, the intergenerational trauma and excessive trauma that we still carry as a nation, which requires psychological intervention. We know that despite the fact that we've had 30 years of integration, we still have a problem with different race groups and different cultures actually understanding each other. It's about more than now just having 11 official languages and me knowing how to greet in Zulu. But do we actually understand the impact on our social fabric of what we've gone through? I mean, if you walk around in Germany, I mean, obviously they had the Holocaust and Nazism in the 30s and 40s. You may not talk about Nazism without there being massive repercussions, because they're so scared that people would so value what Nazism was about and not understand the harm that was created by it, because they've invested a lot into actually educating people about the impact of Nazism and why it's wrong and what we need to do. So social, cultural, psychological, healthcare interventions. We also need, I mean, if you look at the fact that apartheid leads to substandard living conditions for targeted people, then what we're going to need is welfare, social development, social security measures that actually target the impact of those living conditions that were imposed. So when we have to fight to have a proper grant system, when we have to fight for a basic income grant, when we've got to fight for to have proper care for elderly in old age homes and things like that, do we understand that a lot of the social problems that we're seeing right now is a legacy of our historical context? I mean, I've been in the nonprofit sector basically my whole working life. I've worked in homelessness, I've worked in gender-based violence, I've worked on children and youth at risk. A lot of the things that you're seeing is intergenerational and long-lasting, chronic, persistent problems that is not going to be changed by just targeting that individual and problematizing the way that they're thinking about their life, because there are systems that are built around them as an individual that they do not have control over, right? So that would be point number 4. Point number 5 would be transformative education.
Before you get to point number 5, some people can make a critique therefore and say, so you're actually supporting the idea that whenever the ANC government is fucking up, because it does fuck up, and then it always hides behind the idea that no, all of these problems are as a result of apartheid legacy. So would you then support that particular view before you go to point number 5?
No. I'm not saying it's just a case of apartheid. I'm saying it's the fact that we haven't addressed apartheid. I mean, we've had like 30 years now post 19.
And who has not addressed
I think
apartheid?
as a society, I mean, not just government, but also professional people. I mean,
Okay.
I sit with doctors and lawyers and psychologists and social workers or whatever, and you can see that the understanding of problems that are confronting us is not also, it's yes, you've got your theoretical frameworks from your training, but you're not adding to that a broader understanding of this of the historical context and the structural issues that are actually creating this, because the structural problems that we have is both historical and continuing, because the racialized capitalism, this is another point, sorry, I'm not jumping to another point, that was the other, because racism was the one logic, racial capitalism was the other, that drove apartheid, right? That still exists today.
Okay.
So if we don't understand what apartheid is, we don't understand the legacy of apartheid from the past, and we don't understand how it is presenting itself today in the present. So we're constantly developing solutions that are inadequate.
Okay. Okay, I see you. Point number 5.
Point number 5 is transformational education. We speak a lot about quality education. I don't know if we really have a shared comprehensive idea of what quality education looks like. But we need to go beyond just quality education. For me, quality means meeting standards, right? But even if we had to meet the standards of this quality education ideal that we are pursuing, we would still need transformational education. And by that, I mean understanding the cognitive violence that was experienced by Black and brown peoples in this country for centuries, that was meant to stunt your, not only your intellectual development, but the confidence that you have in your own intellect, right? So you find people not achieving success or reaching their full potential because of the legacy of this cognitive violence. And so transformatory education would then be methods of teaching that would target the impact of this what's the word I'm looking for? Pedagogy of domination, right? This teaching method that was geared towards domination of Black peoples, right? So we need transformational education. We need labor interventions. If we've had a country that is based on labor exploitation and heavily skewed labor relations, right? Then we need to have specifically targeted, and I'm not a labor studies person, but we would need specifically targeted interventions in the labor market to counteract that effects, right? Where am I? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7 would be reparations, land reform, and economic interventions. So, you know, there is just not sufficient capital within Black communities to actually bring about the kind of developmental efforts that we need. Ideally, you would like people to get to a point where they can sustain themselves over a long period of time, but that can't happen without a particular input of capital, and that will come from reparations. We still, as a country, do not want to effectively engage with the reparations debate. Land reform, I'm saying this because, you know, the convention specifically looks at the dispossession of land, but what I'm always saying, and people that know me, I'm always banging on this drum, that we need to actually be talking about property reform, because Black peoples were dispossessed of more than just land. One of the things that I feel very, very passionate about is the fact that intellectual property was stolen from Black peoples. Our knowledge is about how to do particular things that can bring economic benefit has been taken over and controlled by first the colonizers and then the dominant group within apartheid, right?
Make an example of these medicines that they are currently known as indigenous knowledge systems now at these predominantly pharmaceuticals. We know about that. They are being manufactured and they're being processed at the CSIR under the new name now, indigenous knowledge systems, and nobody is given an acknowledgement about that knowledge. As if it came from, it was like a manna coming from heaven, a nonsensical thinking, by the way. Yes, so it's a very important point that you're putting across, and I love the fact that you're saying the international systems in its quest to fight against apartheid, it has not, let me say that, I'm not sure if I'm correct, it has not adequately dealt with the issue of apartheid because there are various layers of how apartheid affected people in South Africa, and
But
therefore,
also because,
it,
the international system is itself complicit, and the kinds of laws and systems that were entrenched here in order to bring this about, you will find elsewhere also.
yeah, they
So,
draw from the Americas. They draw from the Americas, which was has always been a dominant after World War II.
but it would
So
be
they drew
completely
from the Americas.
hypocritical.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it would be completely hypocritical to say there's something wrong with that when you're actually doing the exact same thing where you are. I mean, one of the things that we benefit now is that we, through globalization and the advances in technologies, that you can speak to people who are going through similar things in other countries. You can speak to activists in the Americas. You can speak to in North America, Latin America. You can speak to activists in Asia and in the Pacific Islands, and they tell you the same thing. Governments are doing the same things, they're experiencing similar sorts of oppression.
I see. I see.
So dismantling it must happen at both levels. It must happen domestically and it must happen internationally. And we need to understand the ways in which the international law and the international system makes what is happening at a local level possible. But we also need to understand how the inaction at a local level legitimizes the inaction at an international level.
And once, as we are talking about the inactions of the international level, there's a in 1974 there was a serious debate and a quest from the non-state actors utilizing state actors around the issue of disbarring or expelling the South African apartheid regime from the United Nations. Can you take us there a little bit so that after this, if there's anything else that you want to present, we can begin to go forward as to had the processes like TRC happened, or I mean did not happen, had the negotiation did not happen, would the international system solve our problem, the South African apartheid? I'm asking now, 74 was something that was very critical in the non-state actors and state actors in the United Nations. Just take us through there for our viewers to get your thoughts.
Okay, so I'm just going to quickly contextualize 1974 before speaking directly to that. And I know, Tando, that you are also a student of history. That is what your master's in. So if you want to also chip in, you're more than welcome. But I mean, in terms of intervention from the side of the international system in the affairs of a particular sovereign state, right? That can only happen in very defined ways, and that's defined by international law. So let me actually just start there. So Article 7 of the UN Charter outlines in Article 39 that it is the mandate of the UN Security Council to analyze the peace and security situation and to determine the threat and to recommend what measures should be taken. It then can recommend provisional measures and give time for the affected states to comply, and if not, it can then escalate those, right? And then Article 41 talks about the various kinds of recommendations or interventions, so it's obviously military, but before that there are various kinds of sanctions and political and diplomatic methods that could be used. But Article 42 then says if the measures in Article 41 prove to be inadequate, you can then use military force to maintain and restore international peace and security, right? So what you see already from international law is that there needs to be sort of an evolution of how you define and how you intervene in these sorts of situations. So after Sharpeville, which is why this is actually how today's podcast came about, because we kind of touched on this when we were talking about Sharpeville in March, to say that Sharpeville was the incident that catapulted the fight against apartheid really into the international realm and making it a priority. So you have, for the first time, the UN Security Council then getting involved in 1960 with Resolution 134, where the violence and deaths in Sharpeville are condemned, and apartheid is then declared a threat to international peace and security. So this completely changes the game, because this now means that what apartheid then becomes, and what is happening in South Africa, then becomes something of concern to the UN Security Council, right? After Resolution 134, we have 15 other resolutions. And it kind of escalates in the strength, of the kind of language that is being used. And you actually see this whole evolution of the stance. If you read each of those resolutions in turn, the stance that the UN Security Council is taking against South Africa. So, things start off particularly, because, the General Assembly was also involved. So you see already from the General Assembly side, they're looking at apartheid in terms of violations of the UN Charter, violations of human rights, and looking and moralizing, what apartheid is. But when the UN Security Council gets involved, it is then now about seeing it as a military situation, a security situation, a economic situation, a political situation, right? So in the 60s, they start off small, and they, they forbid the sale and shipment of arms, ammunition, and military vehicles to South Africa. But it starts off as voluntary. Then in the 70s, you see a shift where they make a political statement in Resolution 311 in 1972, where they then declare that the race conflict and the resultant violence is directly caused by the policies of apartheid and what the state apparatus are doing. It also then declares that the liberatory movements or resistance movements in South Africa are legitimate in what they're doing to oppose it. So now we start to see a political shift from the 70s. At the same time that this is happening, we have the economic interests that various countries have, particularly Western countries have in South Africa, linked to the arms industry, linked to mining, linked to a number of things that are being threatened now by the escalation of apartheid and the gaze of the international community on apartheid. So, you have these tensions. You have what the international community thinks ideally needs to happen with apartheid. And then you have a Security Council that has 5 permanent members, with 3 members who are from the West, who have defined economic and political interests in South Africa that are being threatened by having to deal with the apartheid in South Africa, right? So in 1974, you have UN General Assembly Resolution 3207, where the political fight that had been simmering up until this point with regards to how to deal with apartheid coming to a head. And so, the UN General Assembly, you've got all of the states in the international community involved. In the UN Security Council, you've only got select members, and the permanent members are UK, US, France, Russia, and China. So you've got to deal with their agenda and their interests directly. So these things are now conflicting to some extent. So you have in 1974 this UN General Assembly resolution that says, directly ask the UN Security Council to investigate the relationship between South Africa and the UN, given the fact that there are persistent violations of UN resolutions by South Africa, because up until this point, all of the resolutions that are being passed are being ignored by apartheid South Africa. And the General Assembly is saying in an indirect way, but also a very direct way, that we're saying we know that the obstacle to dealing with apartheid in South Africa is
in the other forum. Yes.
Yeah. And so you have the UN Security Council now being forced by this resolution then to meet, to do this investigation. And at this meeting, a proposal is tabled by one of the non-permanent members to say South Africa needs to be expelled from the UN because of what it's doing with apartheid. Not only are they not only is the policy and practice and the system of apartheid violating the Charter and human rights, but the recommendations and the measures that have been taken to cause them to stop doing it, they are ignoring. So then they cannot form part of the international community anymore. They need to be expelled. That proposal is vetoed by the US, the UK, and France.
Is the UK that you are talking about, UK, US, and France, the very same ones that have have been pushing for this arrest of Vladimir Putin? Okay, no, proceed, continue.
And then you have another situation, which is what I think what you're speaking to, where the proposal is tabled again at the UN Security Council level to say South Africa needs to be expelled. Because it was vetoed the first time, they then come up with more evidence, more reports that try and galvanize more political support for this idea, and they table it again.
And this is why it is important. I love the way that you are discussing the United Nations. When we were discussing the TRC as well, we were talking about majority of people need to understand that when these commissions or these global bodies, they tend to have subsidiary committees underneath them. So the Security Council is part and parcel of the United Nations. So the Security Council is given a mandate to do something. Then there's a veto that is being put in place by a certain group of 3 countries in the United Nations. I want the viewers to understand what you're saying. Then the debate says, okay, if the Security Council does not take the position because of the vetoing that has taken place in another committee, which is the Security Council, let's bring it back into the General Assembly. Let's bring it now to the bigger platform. So this is how then the laws of the community, international community, tend to be manipulated in the process, and even they then absolve these crimes against humanity, these apartheids that are happening across the world, because already you have given us an understanding that it's not only just something that was related to South Africa or that was just a jurisprudential matter, but it was something that was beyond that small understanding of apartheid as a legal problem or a legal system.
And if you take it again back to a decolonial lens, right? Then you will understand that the 3 members that vetoed in the Security Council are are states who were colonizers. And a lot of the states who are pushing for change in apartheid are states who experienced colonization.
I see.
And are going through a process of decolonization to get freedom from colonial masters. So they have an interest in seeing
in maintaining
the fight against apartheid
quo
in South Africa being successful, because then these other countries, African countries, Latin American countries, Asian countries, can then also similarly use those tools for their own fight against coloniality and racism and apartheid.
Which will affect the benefits, the material benefit and capitalism that was being perpetuated by those particular states that we had mentioned. Had we not, in South Africa, had we not opted for the negotiations, had we not opted for the TRCs, had we not opted for the Rainbow Nation narrative, had we not opted for the multi-party negotiation process, CODESA 1, CODESA 2, and the one that changed multi-party negotiations, had we not all opted for all of those things, majority of people say that there was going to be a civil war. So these processes, they solved or they averted a civil war, an argument that I totally disagree with, by the way. If there were people who would go and listen to my podcast with Power FM 98.7, I put that across very clearly that I disagree with that particular notion that these processes. But from your thought, had all of these things not happened, what would the international communities, how would South Africa would have looked probably if, let's say now, had all of these things did not happen, what would the international system help us?
Look, I mean, all we can do is speculate. But the reality
Speculate,
is with
yes.
these 16 UN security, because remember, it's only the UN Security Council that has the mandate to authorize intervention, right? So it's very, very important what happens at the UN Security Council level. And yet you find former colonizing states controlling the permanent 5 members and controlling, or at least being in the majority in the permanent 5 members, and trying to control the agenda for their own benefit, right? But I mean, the law is clear. You need the UN Security Council to analyze and declare and determine the threat, and then you need to have provisional measures, and then if those are not successful, then you can escalate and eventually end up with using force, military intervention, right? So on the question of was there a threat to international peace and security, that was already established in 1960 and was the basis for all the other resolutions that came after that, right? And if you look at the time when the negotiations were happening, South Africa was burning. There were many formations that were making South Africa ungovernable. You had young people standing up, you had civic movement standing up, you had trade unions standing up. We still had the armed resistance movements active in that time. 1985, you have the state of emergency being declared. And my argument is all of these material conditions on the ground, did it not justify declaring South Africa, apartheid South Africa, to be a serious threat? Because not only was apartheid a problem in South Africa, but also this conflict was then spilling over into the wider SADC region. So it was absolutely a conflict that had international dimensions, right? Then secondly, we need the other non-military interventions to be declared inadequate by virtue of the kind of discussions that are happening at various committees and meetings of the UN and the kinds of reports. I mean, you know, there's just no time to actually unpack all of the different reports that were tabled and the quality of that evidence about that, you know, that explains what was happening, you know, in South Africa at the time, right? Absolutely justified saying that the sanctions and the other measures were not working. We also had the problem of, you know, states being accused of circumventing the sanctions in any case. Right? So clearly, I mean, states that are doing business with apartheid South Africa circumventing those sanctions, right? So that's question number 2. So clearly, number 1, on threat to international peace and security, you've got that. Number 2, provisional measures being inadequate, you've got that. The only kind of challenge that I have about possibly having moved forward with military forces, we don't know what the impact would have been on Black and brown peoples in South Africa, right? If the world had gone to war against apartheid South Africa, would Black people be conscripted into the army? You know, what was going to be the impact on the actual material conditions of the very oppressed people that you're trying to assist, right? That would have to be fully discussed and thought through. Okay. And then the other complication is, how do we then apportion responsibility? How do we divide that up? To what extent do we put blame at the feet of corporates here, multinational corporates, at the feet of the South African state, at the feet of international community, at the feet of particular international states that were complicit in facilitating apartheid. How we divide up those responsibilities and then come up with a strategy as to how to hold them accountable would have been complicated, but not insurmountable. Right?
Isn't that the idea was probably to try and reverse the complicated system of apartheid, because what made it succeed was the fact that it was also complicated and it had all these global forces, racial capitalism, elements of imperialism, financial imperialism, and all these elements that makes it more complicated. Probably that's what made it succeed as well. And to reverse that process, it was also going to need a very strong approach into uncomplicating it. I think that was going to be a very tedious task, but I still say it probably might have been better than the situation that we find ourselves in, where you are saying we thought we were fighting against apartheid, but instead we have created a new form of apartheid and a type of racism that is entrenched and perpetuated.
But the current international system, right, evolved out of the post-World War II situation, right? And if we had genuinely learned from what had happened with Nazism and Germany, right, where Germany was defeated in war, and thereafter certain measures could be put in place in order to bring about justice and account for the harms that were experienced by the victims. It was completely, in my mind, a much more victim-centered approach than what we saw in South Africa in apartheid. You're dealing with apartheid. We were more concerned about the complications for the international system than what would be just for those that had experienced the harms of apartheid.
So you're saying that the Germany experience is that that society, I mean, that government of Germany, the Nazi government, was defeated, fled down, and for it to move back up, it had to be raised up by these international community rules that would say to it, you are going to adhere to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because already you are moving from a weaker position than the apartheid South African government, which was more powerful. It was weak, but it was not, probably it was on its knees, not necessarily that it was fallen flat, or it was just exhausted, or whatever the case might be, but it was not at its weakest level.
Look, I mean, and you know, a post apartheid, because apartheid's not really dead, but a better settlement, if I could put it that way, would have not just been about the international community dictating to South Africa what needs to happen, but the international community consulting and working with the people who experience as the Black people to say, this is what we want. We did not have a sufficient say in how apartheid was addressed. We were not in the rooms at Cadesa. We were not at the table when TRC was being designed. All of these measures, as the people of South Africa and the people who experienced the legacy of apartheid, right? And that is a fundamental weakness of how the international system deals with human rights abuses as a whole, is that there isn't sufficient consultation with the people affected. And for me, it completely makes a mockery of this norm within the international law system that says it's built on universality. In other words, that the law should govern all peoples and govern all peoples equally. But we know that rule of law is a fallacy, it's a myth that doesn't actually exist. I'm not saying it isn't an ideal that we should strive for, but the reality is that rule of law doesn't exist because the law does not apply equally. And we see that with how apartheid was dealt with and prosecuted, and actually never been prosecuted adequately in South Africa, because we don't genuinely believe in universality. Even, that's why I say, even within the workings of international law, you see the workings of this inequality again and again and again. And the universality that it claims to have can be, the veneer of that can be very easily wiped off with just a little bit of a critical and historical analysis.
It is, and as a way of closing off, and I'm just going to throw a curveball here, is that there is a contestation and the de-dollarization of a society of South Africa, as one were to say. There is this particular conversation that is taking place in the world. There's a contest between the BRICS, there's a contest between this NATO, and already you hear people who are saying uh, uh, um, Russian President Putin must be arrested, and there are others who saying, but the Americans have been part and parcel of a problem of the abuse of the rule of law and the human rights and all of these elements. And already there you are able to see how the inequality of implementation of these rules. You look at Ukraine, everybody who is a white European descendant, when there was a war in Ukraine, everybody was saying we must support Ukraine. But now there's a war in Sudan. There's not much going on when it comes to Western powers saying, no, let's get involved in this Sudan war that is taking place. So you can see these examples taking place in the society currently. And I want to say that I agree with you, and these are examples that are there. Tana, what is your closing remarks into this particular conversation? If somebody just arrives and watches this live stream, and then they only pick it up at this moment, what would you say you have said in this entirety of this 1 hour, 8 minutes?
Apartheid is a system, and it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. And the scope is both international and local. And if we want to address this adequately, and if we are in any way interested in justice, we need to get much more comprehensive and much more intentional about, and much more honest about where these inequalities arise from and what it's going to take to overcome them. And everybody needs to do their part. Yes, the lawyers need to do their part and the politicians have to do their part, but every sector of society. So if you're in healthcare, what can you do from healthcare side? If you're in education, what can you do from that side? If you're in arts and culture and you do cultural work and history and heritage, we haven't even had a chance to talk about revisionism in history and memorialization and that sort of stuff. There's a part to play. There's a part to play in every sector of society to dismantle the system. And to counteract its power and to build people power so that the world actually has meaning and benefit for everybody and not just a few.
Just straight, direct questions for you. Did the TRC succeed in what it wanted to achieve in relation to the dismantling of apartheid?
Well, I mean, there's a difference between the stated objective of the TRC and what we can infer the agenda of the TRC is based on what we now know 20 years on. So did it achieve reconciliation? Did it unearth truths? Did it build social cohesion and build our nation? Absolutely not. Did it bring accountability and justice? Absolutely not. But did it bring us closer? I mean, in terms of the information that we were able to gather, and which we might not have known if we didn't embark on some sort of fact-finding mission. That is useful for the people who participated in that and whose stories were heard and they were able to confront the perpetrators. But for the country as a whole, we have a very long way to go.
I hear you. And thank you very much for joining us, and we appreciate you, and we appreciate you making the time, and we appreciate your ideas, and I hope the viewers at home were able to enjoy your submissions as well. Thank you very much, Tana.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.
Wonderful. Colleagues and friends, we have had another wonderful conversation today with our guest, engaging on the various elements. And I love the fact that she spoke extensively around the issue of let us reinterpret, let us put into perspective what do we mean by apartheid, what do we mean by racism so that we can understand them. And secondly, that we need to understand when we talk about the international law and talk about international politics, these are all elements of an international system. I hope you have learned something like I have done, and I appreciate that you stayed with us and you watched with us this live broadcast. We are going to ensure that this is going to be published tomorrow on Monday at 12 o'clock on YouTube. Make sure that you continue to subscribe to our platform. Umntu ungawuyengayo kamalinge undima kankumbuzo umntana enkosi uthi kuni siyabulela kakhulu for being part and parcel of this conversation, and we are hoping to see you once again next week on another reverting conversation on Pont the Politique, a bridge to politics. See you next time. Bye bye.